Welcome, one and all, onliners, in-towners, whatever the case may be. We're glad you're here to join us for our Stepping Stones Bible study. Yet again, it's so good for you to be here. We are still working our way through the wonderful Bible stories that we have here. Did I tell you? My name's Chip Conrad, I'm a storyteller. Got lots of stories to tell you and lots of Bible studying to do on our Bible study. Because this Stepping Stones Bible study, if you haven't watched any of these yet, is a little bit different. What we're doing with our Bible study is we're studying Bible stories and really breaking them down. But we're studying them not just in in-depth ways, but we're studying them in different ways too. We're doing some artistic storytelling, which we'll be getting to very shortly, as well as everything in between we can think of. And tonight, it's going to be a little different as well. That's just kind of the way we roll. We like doing things a little different, digging into the meat and potatoes of the scriptures that we maybe have never tasted before. So that's kind of what we're after. Again, in order to do this, we have to pray for fresh revelation from the Holy Spirit every week, because it is very, very interesting to see what God is really trying to tell us in an old story that we think we know really, really well. If you haven't watched, we've done a couple lessons already. We did the basic story of Jericho. We've also learned about Rahab and her importance to the whole story. And then last week, we talked about the captain of the host of the Lord. Well, who is he? Well, he's part of the Jericho story. If you haven't read it, he's in there. You'll definitely want to learn about it, because we found out that it really represents the Lord of hosts, who is Jesus. Jesus was at Jericho. Super cool. All right, tonight we're going to do another character study. We're going to dig deep again, except this character study is going to be a little bit different. The character is the wall of stone. That's what we're studying, not a person. The wall. You're saying, wait a minute. Walls don't have character. Well, I beg to differ. Walls do have character. If we look back in our history, we can see that there's all kinds of different architecture and design that tells the character of a certain culture at a certain time period in history. Let's say the Japanese culture, the European culture, the French culture, German culture. It doesn't matter. There is a architecture thread, a design thread that runs through there that tells you when and where these things were put together and why. So stone can have character. Walls can have character. So we're going to dig into the character of the walls of stone of Jericho. Now here's one of the interesting things about the design and character of the walls. They had windows. You're thinking, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. We're talking about a defensive wall for the most defended, most fortified city in all of the Promised Land. Just so happened to be coincidence, that's the first one that the Hebrews are going to have to take out. It's Jericho. These massive, really high defensive walls had windows. And I'm not talking about the kind of windows we see in medieval castles, where it's just this little narrow slit like this, so you can get your arrow through and shoot somebody down on the ground who's trying to attack your castle. Not that kind of window. We're talking about a regular window. No glass, that allows air in and out of the castle. But this is just a wall around the city. How do we know this? In Joshua 2:15, when we studied Rahab, Rahab let the spies down through her window, and she lived on the city wall, in the city wall. Her house was part of the city wall. And you think, well, that's kind of weird. Because the whole time I thought, exactly, the whole time you thought the exact same thing I thought. I grew up listening to Sunday school and listening to people teach about the walls of Jericho. They were so wide you could have 6 chariots riding on them side by side. Well, if you hear that kind of statement, that may have been physically, take a tape measure, how wide the wall was. I don't know. But it gives you the connotation, and it makes your brain think, well, these are super, super thick defensive walls. Impenetrable walls. Well, again, when we read the Bible and see what God actually wrote, we find out that her house was in the wall. And not only her house was in the wall, she hides the spies on the roof where she's got a whole bunch of grain to hide them under. So you can't really drive chariots on the top of the wall. It's somebody's roof. And they got their stuff up there. That's their attic. That's not where chariots race. So you have to change your idea about the character of the walls of Jericho to be, well, this is more like a really fortified stone city, connected houses, if you will. A giant apartment complex. See, it's a totally different character. It's a totally different way to look at the walls. Were they big? Were they formidable? Were they impenetrable? Yes and no. Let's look at some other stories about people, or at least one, who can corroborate our idea that the walls are actually not just there for fortification and protection. Nehemiah 3, the whole chapter. What's Nehemiah doing back in Jerusalem? He goes back there because God gives him an idea. You know what? I need you to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. Well, we're talking about the walls around Jericho. So it's the same type of wall. It's the outer defensive wall. And the whole chapter, he's describing all the different people who are working on the wall. And they're working on the part where their house is, where their business establishment is. Merchants, jewelers, people like that, they all had places established where the wall was. That was where their place of business was. That was also where their houses were. So he said, hey, you live here, you build this section. So they were building the wall because it was all connected. And it says, so-and-so built it from here to there. So-and-so built it from there to the next spot. And it's the whole description of who built what where. But if you think about it, they were building their house, their business, that also happened to be an exterior wall that ringed around all of Jerusalem, which is what we have here. Now, just want to apologize for being late this evening. It took me a long time to draw this brick wall. Just kidding. But we had so much to dig into that it just took me a little bit longer. Let's just say I hit a wall studying. Anyway, jokes. I've got jokes all day. Okay, Nehemiah, they had to build a wall, so they've got a wall just like Jericho, people living in the wall. We have another example in the Bible that this is not a one-off. This is not just a weird thing. That's the way they did it back then. Okay. Now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to see what God has to tell us. If there's more that he can tell us about Jericho's walls of stone. So to do that, we need to understand walls in general. Okay? So walls are not just made of stone. Can you think of some other types of walls? Now, walls are made of stone. That's true. Like castles. Castle walls, walls that go around cities like Jerusalem and Jericho. Those are made of stone. And that is absolutely true. And some of them are pretty formidable. The walls of Troy, it said, were never ever breached. How did the Greeks defeat them? They snuck in a Trojan horse filled with army guys. And nobody suspected anything. So they brought it in the walls themselves. And the Trojans brought the enemy in with them themselves. The walls themselves were never beaten. So some stone walls are pretty tough. But not all castles and not all fortifications like that have stone for their wall. In fact, some places don't have the stone, so they use wood. You ever seen the movie Braveheart? They have a wooden fortification that the leader of the town is trying to protect himself with. Well, they end up storming that wooden fortification and beating the guy anyway, but it is a wooden fortification, a wooden castle, if you will. There's no stone, so it's all wood. So you can have that a different way. But when I started looking at wood, I started thinking, you know what? There are other kind of walls made out of wood. Can a fence be a wall? Well, sure it can. Fences are also walls. Fences can also be made out of other things. Wire, metal. Our neighbor has a plastic fence. Never seen that before. Plastic. Okay?
Vinyl.
But it's, well, vinyl is plastic. So you have basically a type of thing that is not your normal stone, but it's all made this way. It's all made to do something. We'll get to that in a second. Now let's switch gears a little bit. We're talking about something that is normal. How about walls of water? We've studied that before in Firm Foundations class. They walked through the Red Sea on dry ground with walls of water on either side of them. And it says specifically that it looked like walls. The water looked like walls. So walls of water. Tsunamis, giant waves have also been called walls of water. So water itself can also be a type of wall. So write that down. What about wind? For those of us who have lived down south, Louisiana, Texas, Florida, places like that, you know about something called the eye wall of a hurricane. That is the very edge of the center of the hurricane where the wind is so fast right there, and then you break in and there's no wind right in the middle. That eye wall, that wall then is made of wind, just like a hurricane. Let's say eye wall. Now, for all my rock and roll buddies, there's also something called a wall of sound. Yeah. I particularly like walls of sound in certain cases, and sometimes walls of sound can actually drive people away because it's too loud or too this or too that. And it doesn't really matter the style of music. I just was saying that it normally falls under rock and rollers who like our walls of sound. But walls are not just physical. Walls can also represent other things in our life that are not physical at all. For example, what does the walls that we're talking about that are physical here represent? Well, most of these cases, like here in the top, we're talking about castle walls and stuff like that. Those are representing protection. We're trying to be protected from the enemies, from the elements. The walls of your house are trying to protect you from the elements. So it's trying to keep something out. All right? But walls are also not just for protection. Walls are also for barriers. And I'm breaking this out as a category. We're not just a barrier to, like the walls of your house, a barrier to the elements. Okay, we're talking about barriers as in, I can no longer go this direction. I must detour because that is now a wall. That wall may be a guy standing there with a sign that says detour. That sign may actually be a wooden sign that's blocking the road. That is a detour. It's causing you to change direction. It is a barrier from you going a certain place. Here's a fun story about a barrier. All right, I'm going to tell you about Hadrian's Wall. You may not have ever heard of Hadrian's Wall, or maybe you have. Hadrian's Wall, very, very famous wall across the pond in Britain. Now this wall, here's how it comes. I'm going to give you the super short version. All right, you ready? Here we go. When the Romans were conquering the known world, because they did at one point in time, they made it to the island of Great Britain and easily conquered part of it, lower half. When they started moving north into Scotland, they ran into some very fierce resistance. Okay? This wall of people, if you will, basically beat them back so much that the Romans built a wall from the east to the west, all the way across the middle of Great Britain. Why? To keep the Scots from coming south and running them out of Britain altogether. Because that's what was happening. They ran into an enemy that they could not get past. They ran into a barrier. So they protected themselves with Hadrian's Wall and built it all the way across. There's still remnants of it there today. It's fantastic and fascinating. Go see it if you ever get a chance. Yes, that is a true story. So we have some protection and barriers. We have things that these walls are doing. But I'm not going to get to a real psychological class here for you. I'm just going to pull one little nugget out for us. What about claustrophobia? Is that a wall? That's a wall of fear. Things closing in around you. But it could be because something physically is happening, or it just could be inside your brain. But here's what's happening. Let me give you another story, because I like stories. This is somebody else's story. A little story you may have heard about called Star Wars. Yeah, and there were some heroes there in the middle of this story. And what happened to them? They fell down into a giant trash compactor. And the walls started closing in. Have you ever felt that way? Claustrophobic? The walls closing in on you, getting smaller and smaller and tighter and tighter. Those are walls. Whether or not they're physical or just in our brains, you can be claustrophobic and have plenty of space around you. Okay? So that is a type of wall. And I'm just trying to use that one as like a big one to refer to a lot of types of walls that our own brains will do, because this is not a psychology class. It's Bible study. Woohoo! So what we need to do is, there's probably a whole lot more walls you can think of. But what we've got here is some walls that we can look at real quickly and understand there is a common denominator to all these walls, physical or non-physical. And here it is. Walls are providing separation. It's a separation from something. Whether it is separation from enemies, separation from the route I was trying to go, separation from the water from attacking us, the wind from tearing us up, protection from barriers, claustrophobia. It is providing a sort of separation between what we're feeling and what is out there. This is a wall of separation. So that's what we're dealing with, is walls are designed by their very nature, physical or not, to separate, to divide. All right. That brings us back to Jericho. That's our Bible study. That's our story we're studying. So what do the walls of Jericho, the stones themselves, represent? Because we looked at all these other ideas. What do the stones of Jericho represent? Well, because this is a Bible study, I dug a lot in our Bible to look at some other types of stones and what they represented. And you'll know most of the stones that you'll study, and this is a great Bible study for you as a sidebar if you want to dig into this, all represent some form of judgment. I'm going to pull some out for you. Judgment. Here's an example of a Bible story you may know. Little David. He's got 5 stones. And what is he doing with those stones? He looses one of those stones and he judges the enemy, Goliath, for coming against the nation of Israel and trying to get the nation of Israel to submit to the Philistines. You have attacked us and our God. Guess what? With this stone you were judged. And David judged Goliath. Judgment. What about another story in the New Testament? We'll skip around. The stoning of Stephen. He was stoned because they thought he was a heretic. They thought he was doing something wrong when all he was doing was preaching about Jesus and the love of Jesus. And Saul was one of the people at that stoning. And later, God knocks him down and says, hey, why are you persecuting me? And so God basically comes back and changes Saul into Paul and turns him into the guy who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. But it all started with the stoning of Stephen, where they were judging him, whether it was right or wrong, they were judging him and killed him. Now, people are not the only ones who've used stones to judge. God himself used it a couple times. In fact, we're in Joshua 5 when we're doing this whole Jericho Bible study. Just a few more chapters down the road, Joshua 10, there's a story about God using hailstones as judgment. And I'm not even talking about the one you already know. You thought I was going to say something else. He did it more than once. Of course, Sodom and Gomorrah, hailstones for judgment. But in Joshua 10, another sidebar study for you, God uses stones for judgment. And then there's this story. I had to write this one down. I didn't want to just paraphrase this one. This is back in the New Testament. You ready? John 8, 3 through 7. John 8, 3 through 7. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the center of the court, they said to him, that's Jesus, Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery, in the very act. Now the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. What then do you say? Verse 6, they were saying this, testing him so that they might have grounds for accusing him. They're trying to judge Jesus. That's what accusation is. But Jesus stooped down, and with his finger he wrote on the ground. When they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said, He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw the stone at her. You know the rest of the story. Nobody threw any stones because they were not without sin. So they tried to accuse Jesus, and he flipped it right back on them. Excuse me? You have sinned too. Should we stone you? That's the implied meaning here. No, they dropped their stone and went home. Well, that didn't work. Because, let me give you another story. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was someone who was also spared stoning because her husband Joseph would not accuse her of any wrongdoing when she was pregnant with Jesus and they had not slept together. So he didn't accuse her of anything wrong. He had to hear from God to really do that. But he did not judge her. So what happens is, she was spared the stoning that the law of Moses said she should have had. Just like this adulteress that Jesus spared from stoning by telling all the Pharisees, well, if y'all have no sin, go ahead, get the show started. If not, y'all can leave. What happens in both of those two situations is this. Mercy triumphs over judgment. You'll find that in James 2, verse 13, the second half of it, 13b. James 2, 13b. Mercy triumphs over judgment. All Hebrews. Ready? After crossing the Jordan River, they're camped at a place that God tells them the name of. It's called Gilgal. We've actually taught on this a few weeks back. You can go dig it up on the page here. In Gilgal, the people themselves are compared to stones. Huh? Trust me, we did it. We already taught this. Go check out that message. 12 stones that are taken out of the river for each of the 12 tribes. It represents them. So the stone represents the people. That's why they're placed there. Now, they're placed in a circle. And what Gilgal means, the reason they named it that, kind of covering old ground here, but it's necessary for what we're doing. Rolling away the reproach. So we've got a circle of stones, but it means rolling away, taking away. And it says it back in, I think it's Joshua 1, where it says, the reason I want you to name this, no, it's Joshua 3. I want you to name this is so that you can roll away the reproach of Egypt. Well, the reproach means the shame of sin. Or here's another way to word that. Reproach is just another form of judgment. I don't know about you, but I was bullied a lot as a kid. Picked on, judged, made fun of. Shame was put against me because people were judging me for the way I was or the things I did or things I didn't do or whatever the case may be. That form of shame, that form of reproach, God names this camp, Gilgal, as a rolling away. I don't want you to bring this reproach from Egypt, the sin. We're slaves. I don't want you to have, you ready for it? That identity anymore. We're moving on with a new name. I'm going to call this Gilgal. We're starting over. Okay? You are now stones. I'm jumping way ahead of myself. I'm going to go ahead and say it. Living stones. All right. Here's what happened. Jumping back to Jesus' time, when Jesus came out of the grave, he rolled away the stone of reproach, giving us grace instead. Mercy triumphed over judgment because of what Jesus did. The irony of Jericho is that the people who were stones circled Jericho, the wall of stone. Stones circling stones, rolling away the reproach. Let me show you what your new identity really is. Let me show you what your new identity really can do. Let me give you a physical example of who you are. Why are the walls of stone so important? Because here's what we can learn from it. Proverbs 17, verse 19, second half of the verse. First half's good too. Second half of the verse says this very specifically. It's kind of like he squished two proverbs into one. It says this: he who builds a wall invites destruction. Another version that I read, one translation said, anyone who trusts in high walls invites disaster. Pride comes before a fall. Any of these things you can just kind of run together because that's what we're talking about here. We create these walls of separation, and what happens is we put our trust that is going to keep us safe. And in Nehemiah himself, he says, don't look at these walls for your strength. The joy of the Lord is our strength, not the walls that you built in 52 days. So we cannot look to this separation to salvage us. Awful, awful things going on in North Wyoming and Montana with flooding and stuff going on right now. My wife and I watched a picture of somebody's house get pulled into the river and swept away. The whole house. It's like it just sheared it off at the foundation, picked it up like you would off of a saucer, like a piece of cake, and just threw it into the river. It was awful, tragic. Their walls did not protect them from the elements. That separation, you cannot always put your trust in. We know who we can put our trust in. We can put our trust in someone who's a lot better than walls of stone. Because what happens is when we're doing that, we, as individuals, are placing these walls ourselves. We're building those. We're building the separation because we think that'll save us, protect us. That'll keep the enemy at bay. So what happens is we build these walls up around our very hearts because we think that they're going to protect us. Praise the Lord, Jesus has a different plan.
Yes.
He has put a new covenant in place.
Amen.
And here's the scriptures. They're even old covenant scriptures for you. Ezekiel 11:19 and Ezekiel 36:26. They both pretty much say the same thing, so I'm kind of packing them together. Ezekiel 11:19, Ezekiel 36:26. They both say this. God will take away the heart of stone from out of our flesh and give us a heart of flesh. In Hebrews, it goes on to explain that that heart of flesh is the Spirit of God. Once again, showing us that mercy triumphs over judgment. Mercy breaks down those walls, takes them out, tears them out. Those walls that we built, mercy comes along, the walls that we built, and knocks them down. Just like Jericho, the walls fall down flat. It's like they weren't even there. They just go away. And what are we left with? God's miracle for the Hebrews was that he knocked the wall of Jericho down flat. For us, it's a reminder of all of the things we just talked about and this. One of my favorite scriptures, believe it or not, Proverbs 17:3. The crucible is for silver, the furnace is for gold, but the Lord tests hearts. He's after our hearts, guys. And what does he want to do with our hearts? This is where it's getting good. What does he want to do with our hearts? Let's look at Jesus. Jesus is the stone that the builders rejected. But he became the chief cornerstone. Of something he's building. Our heart of flesh. Because see, he himself is the rock, the stone by which we are judged. He says, he who's without sin cast the first stone. He is our rock. He is our measure. He is our judgment. He is the stone. But he is what doing for us? What is he doing for us? He rolls away our reproach. That means he's also our Redeemer. He is our rock and our Redeemer. He's the stone and the grace. He's the judgment and the mercy. He gets to decide what to do when. All we have to do, because of what he's done for us, is to walk in it, say it with me, freedom! That's right. We get to walk in freedom because he rolled away that reproach, because mercy triumphs over judgment, because of what he did on the cross and being raised from the dead. That has come full circle, Gilgal, to bring us freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. We walk in freedom in the Spirit. We are no longer bound to a heart of stone that we built. Nobody else built that for us. It doesn't matter what your environment was like growing up. You built the stone, the wall of stone. God is here to break it down and release you into a new identity of freedom. Amen. Woo! I'm telling you, this is just Jericho, the Bible story. What else are we going to get into? All the Bible stories that are out there. There's so much wonderful, awesome, amazing revelation God's going to dig up for us, give to us, because we are really pursuing him and who he wants us to be. Because as we pursue him, we pursue Christ, we become more like him. That's how we do it. We don't become more like him by following rules and making sure our stone walls are built up high. That's where disaster and destruction come from. Chase Jesus. We'll get there. That's what we're going to do. Keep chasing Jesus. Next week, another character from Jericho. Can't wait to get into this one. Sure hope you guys can join us next Tuesday night. I'll try not to be late like I was tonight. Apologize for that. But next Tuesday night, Stepping Stones Bible Study, more on Jericho, because there's so much more God has for us, because he wants us to walk in freedom. Thank you very much, guys. See y'all next week.